Hello, this is Dr. Churchill, and we're here again for another lecture for Astronomy 308 Into the Final Frontier. And I just want to say that we are at a situation in the class now which is very interesting from the perspective of the overarching, lesson that I wish to have be a theme for the course. And that theme is the question of, will we repeat the behavior of the past into the future when we go into space? And so we've gone through the sea race to the point of discovering the planet and the direction in which that discovery has taken people in terms of colonization and setting up ports. And really it was all about God, gold, and glory, in a sense. Maybe not in that order, And then, let's move fast forward to where we are today, where we're just beginning to probe outer space. We had our space race in the 1960s, and there was, a Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States that drove that. And there was a lot of geopolitical underlying forces that drove that space race that culminated in the moon landing. And then 50 years of basically really nothing, no state-sponsored trips to space anymore. And it turned out that the barrier to getting to space is pretty tremendous cost-wise. And so it's just now beginning that private companies are investing in the future of going into space. But we're on the precipice of a new age, a new direction for humanity. And as Frank White, our distinguished visiting lecturer said, Frank White, the founder of the Overview Effect, said, are we going to develop a sort of Star Trek universe in which we work together, we respect other beings, we obey things like the Prime Directive to not interfere with other beings, or planets? Do we have respect for the natural resources in the solar system? Do we work together? Okay, do we go out there together? Or do we end up something more like the universe in that the series called The Expanse, in which human beings are not united, that there are territories, that they're fighting it out for their rights, they're fighting it out for control, they're fighting it out for the resources just to survive, as well as resources to become extremely wealthy and powerful and controlling. Which will it be that we are going to do going forward? We know what it was in the past, okay? We've gotten to the point where we've pretty much finished the sea race, and we've seen the Spanish basically clean out the empires of the Americas, okay? We've seen the Portuguese go and pirate and eradicate the trade in the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean and take those ports for control. We've seen slavery begin to happen on a global level. And literally, I would say that the last centuries have been marked by crimes against humanity that nobody could get away with today. And the hope is that nobody would get away with such things in the future as well. So today, we're going to enter into a lecture that covers a period of time that's post-sea race. Spain has settled into the Americas. This is sort of the late 1500s now we're talking about. We've gotten ourselves to. And the Portuguese have settled into Brazil. They've settled into the East Indian Ocean area, taken up all those ports. And they remain pretty much the main powers of the world now. And they never went to war because they had a treaty through the Pope, the Treaty of Tordesillas, and then later the Treaty of Zaragoza. And what they did was then they funded, with all the money that they channeled into their countries, they funded then more control of the area. So Spain in particular entered and funded wars to take over other nations and continue to become the main power. And in fact, they became so powerful that they eventually conquered the Portuguese, okay? And that changed the balance of power. And then they also conquered the Netherlands, where the Dutch were. So a situation here is, will we continue to do this when we go out into the solar system? Is, you know, China or the Soviet Union, or I should say, well, their demise, Russia and the America, the United States, are they going to continue to battle it out? And as we know, the Chinese have now done a lunar landing on the dark side. They've done all kinds of stuff that we're going to talk about in this class, including a sample return of the moon. They're the third nation to have a sample return. The Soviet Union, or now Russia, did that in the 70s. And then, of course, the United States has brought back sample returns from the moon, but through astronauts landing and picking up those rocks. So we also now have the fact that the United Arab Emirates has sent a probe to orbit around Mars, and that just happened this week, that they went into orbit around Mars. Now that's a first for their country. So they're entering this race. You may not realize India has sent many missions to the moon to try to soft land on the moon, and has been within inches of being successful. So this is really starting to pick up amongst the countries. We'll talk about that toward the end of the second module. So all of this is building up. And so what I want to do is take us back to about 1590, 1600, and say, it's the same thing, but it was for the sea race, okay? What is going to happen in the next couple of centuries based upon the beginnings of that sea race, that Cold War between Spain and Portugal? How does that unfold? And what we're going to find out is that it unfolds in a way that I hope we won't have the space race unfold, or the space 2.0 as it's called, or new space unfold in the future. And that is, we got to the point where we had state-sponsored corporations. And these state-sponsored corporations had the backing of the government, the war machine of the government, the funding of the government, then, and the blessing of the government as a company to go out, wage war, take whatever they want, and make as many profits as they want. So the idea of free trade did not exist. Okay, it was about, let's maximize profits, period, plain and simple. Was not what we call capitalism. Okay, it was what I call takeism. All right, so I'm going to share my screen now and go through this, and hopefully you'll find this to be a kind of fascinating story about particularly the Dutch, and we'll touch a little bit on the English and the French as well, and how they spread about the world and how it unfolded to be the world that we live in today. And then the last lecture of this module coming up, 1.5b, is going to be on what, we're going to move right to the modern day, and we're going to say, let's look at the distribution of wealth, let's look at the distribution of communications, let's look at the distribution of economies, religions, language, and we're going to see how that was a complete consequence of the story we're going to tell today, okay, and the sea race. Okay, so I've titled this Taking God, Gold, and Glory to Its Logical Consequence. So this is takeism and really pushing this model to the limit, and we'll see really where it went, okay? So what we have here now is a new human invention. State-sponsored economic monopolies. Okay, that is a new human invention of the time, and is basically taking what the Vikings did, okay, from 800 to 1100, where they started out pillaging and stuff, and then they were able to collect dangeld, which is to say, we won't rape your women and destroy your village and take everything on and kill you at the same time if you just give it to us, okay? And then eventually become traders, and they did engage in fair trade after that. It morphed into fair trade. But taking that idea of the takeism, okay, that started with, well, didn't start with the Vikings, but had certainly grown to a matured level with the Vikings, turning it into a science. I mean, this is really taking it and turning it into a science. Okay. So one of the main companies that we're going to talk about is the Dutch East Indies Company, also known as United East Indies Company, or United Dutch East Indies Company. Various names. And it's a fascinating story. Now, I've got two videos that go along with this lecture. One is the story of the Dutch and how they developed this company, and then how it fell. And it's an excellent video. And then, of course, we have John Green and his crash course also talking about it. But John Green spends a little more time talking about the slavery aspect of it and the way that they used the mechanisms of war to and slavery and crimes and genocide, basically, to purge certain geographic regions of peoples so that they could replace them with slave labor. And it was a horrible time. It's a horrible outcome. And we just want to make sure we don't, repeat this kind of thing. Even if there aren't peoples out there in the solar system, we could end up doing this to each other once we get out in the solar system if we're not paying attention and thinking of ourselves as a unified species. Okay, so even though we've used this term God, gold, and glory, we're just going to be fair here and say emphasis on gold, okay? Emphasis on gold. That's really what shaped the modern world. And I ask you, is it going to shape the future world? Or are we going to get past that and learn to have wealth distribution that is much more equitable so that everybody can have the pursuit of health and happiness, truly? Okay, as I said, before capitalism, there was takeism, the taking, after the taking, slowly capitalism began to take root as it became clear that maintaining your power through war was very expensive. It turned out that the pressures finally developed that it became more of a free trade situation. Okay, by capitalism, we do mean the free trading of goods and the exchanges of goods, okay, gold, monies for items. And by takeism, we mean the unfree trading of goods. Basically, one person or one group does all the taking and then they distribute on the market. Okay, as I said, this is a new phase of humanity that was invented, what I call the geopolitics of business and unchecked state-sponsored extremism. Okay. Okay, so what did this involve? It involved, number one, state sponsorship of monopoly businesses, the creation of a rich investor class in the societies, the rights to conduct acts of war to attain and protect all these commercial interests, port, shipping routes, navigational data, slaves and plantations, and lands. Okay, and the right to conduct crimes against humanity with no consequences, and then the rights to all of the goods, the game, the marine life, the timber, the minerals, the plant life, the gold, everything that you can imagine, okay, is designed to extract it at the cheapest level, at the cost of human life, no matter, and then put it on the market and make the biggest profits possible. The two companies that really are known in history for this are the Dutch East India Company or the United East India Company, also known as the VOC, which is a series of Dutch words which I am not brave enough to try to pronounce. And then, of course, the British East India Company itself. Now, the Dutch East India Company was a much more unified structure, okay? And it was globally dominant and it was unified in terms of all of the components around the globe were unified into a certain group of about 17 individuals that really ran the show. The East India Company, on the other hand, was somewhat a conglomeration of ports around the country, around the world, particularly in the east, throughout India and Malaysia. And they were somewhat in competition with each other. And they worked together, but they also had personal interests amongst themselves. So they weren't quite as united as the VOC or the East India Company of the Netherlands. Okay, so I want to talk to you about how rich this place was. All right, I mean, the Dutch actually put the VOC on their flag, and that's kind of like, can you imagine our flag having a commercial logo on it, like, you know, Apple's logo or something like that? Certainly, I don't think we would put up with Facebook's logo or Amazon's logo. Anyway, one of those logos, right? So these companies that are huge like this, we wouldn't, I don't think, today. But I want to bring your attention to the left-hand side here. By the way, if you like to read Dutch, there in red, I have what the VOC stands for. And like I said, I am not brave enough to pronounce it. So you will not receive the joy of hearing me butcher that. On the left-hand side here, as you can see from my moving arrow, 1637, the worth of the Dutch East India Company was $7.9 trillion. Now let's compare that with the modern day biggest companies, global companies today. And you would have to take Apple, Alphabet, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, the entire Bank of Wells Fargo, etc., ExxonMobil, Bank of America, Netflix, McDonald's, Samsung, and add all of these together, and there's your friend Tesla, okay, to get a net worth of $7.9 trillion. So this really tells you that in the money of that day, they were worth a tremendous amount and dwarfed anything that we think of as a global company, dominant global company today. Absolutely dwarfed them. You can see Apple is the largest, and it only represents some, I don't know what this is, 12% of what the VOC was worth. Okay, and here's a bar graph, history's largest companies throughout time, and you see the Dutch East India Company up here at 7.9 trillion. Interestingly, there are some other trading companies and oil companies that have been larger, but here's your friend Apple down here, and here's Microsoft. Excuse me. Okay. Now, one of the things you're going to learn through the supplementary videos is that because Spain had so much wealth, it conquered other nearby countries, including Portugal, eventually, and it also took control of the Dutch. And it turned out that that was quite easy because the royalty married in to the Spanish monarchy, and then the Spanish monarchy basically took control. And so they were really being squeezed hard. And the Dutch at first, which they were a very strong shipping nation, you know, they had a very strong ability, good navy and whatnot, and good merchant trading with their ships, but they mostly traded with Portugal at Lisbon, their capital. And so they would pick up all of the spices and whatnot in Lisbon, and you may all know that the Portuguese brought those around Africa, and then they would sell their ships out to the various ports in the Mediterranean and whatnot, and they would sell their goods that way. But they were being pressured by Spain, and then Spain, when it took over Portugal, shut down Lisbon and shut down the trade for the Dutch. So you can imagine, whenever that happens, then the economies collapse. There's all kinds of incredible problems and suffering that happen, and anger. Okay, and so there's a pushback, and we'll see that the solution was a development of this VOC company. But sometimes I'll use it interchangeably with the VOC. When the VOC got rolling, okay, what did they do? Well, they came around the Africa, and they overtook the ports and outposts of the Portuguese. And at first, the Portuguese became marginalized, and they actually had to sail mostly along the coasts of Africa and stuff like that. The South African country with the Cape of Good Hope, which was a Portuguese port, got taken away from them, so they had to sail around Africa without being able to stop there. They conquered the present-day Indonesia. This really was their main target, was to go a little bit to the east of where the Portuguese were and really get into those 8 Indonesian islands. Okay, they realized that there was particularly nutmeg and pepper there. They took the coast of Brazil from the Portuguese, and they set up sugar plantations and started a tremendous slave migration from Africa into South America, which explains why there's so many South American Africans, if you will, in Brazil. Okay, so they used local slave labor for these plantations, and basically took these off of the coast of Africa. So they had moved into some of the territory of the Portuguese. The Portuguese really lost control over this period of time. And then they founded the present-day city of New York. They called it New Amsterdam. And before the British were there, the Dutch were there, actually, and had made a foothold in the North American continent in this way. So we're going to talk about the struggle of the North American continent today as well. So here's an example of all of the resources around the world and sort of the main, byways, if you will, of how to get them back to the Netherlands. Now, so where is the Netherlands? The Netherlands are up here in this small little blue country here. As you can see, they're ocean facing, much like when the Portuguese here on the Iberian Peninsula of Spain were also ocean facing. So it turns out that they set up a company that traded in everything that they could, imagine. There were some that were more items that were more lucrative, but they monopolized as many of these markets as they could. Tobacco and sugar, and then, fish, wool, timber, metals, furs, alcohol, tulips, flowers, and then, of course, all the spices and the Chinese quantities or commodities such as silk, porcelain, pepper, tea, cinnamon, and cloves, all kinds of luxury goods. And then, of course, they peddled in moving slaves around the world. As you can see, this map is really nice because it tells you, so where were they getting the herring? Where were they getting the wool or the timber or some of the metals and the wheat and the rye? And then, where were they getting the tobacco? So these arrows are not showing all of their pathways. They're just showing the main byways. Okay. Sugar. This is where the sugar plantations were all set up by bringing slaves from Africa over and having them perform the labor. They took over Cape Town, as I said. Okay. And then they took control of this whole area of the Indian Ocean, forcing the Portuguese, before they were shut down, to really have to hug the coast of Africa, sail wide here, and come back up. They really kind of, pushed them out. Now, I have to say that, this was World War, we're going to find out. And when you watch John Green, he'll talk about how it was World War. Like I said, if you were a ship flying under a different flag and a Dutch ship saw you, they would come at you, and that was it, take you down. Anywhere on the planet, it didn't matter. And so you see here is India, and they had set up some trade routes through here. And really their main area in Indonesia was Batavia here. And they set up the slave labor. They removed some of the indigenous people, replaced them with slaves, and really just leveraged everything they could out of building a profit. So you get a very, very good feeling from this map, I think, of knowing, what goods they were actually monopolizing and extracting and taking, and then also like where they were geographically on the world. And, in the sense, geopolitics and economies have always and always will remain connected. Now let's just briefly compare them to the Portuguese and the Spanish. So this is sort of around 1650 now. we've moved about a half a century up from the late 1500s. Okay, so this is about 130 years after Magellan, for example, had sailed around the nation. So, okay. So on this diagram, the purple represents Spanish strongholds, and you know that they were up here in North America, Central America, and through South America. Cuba had Florida, and they really had this territory all to themselves. And again, this was all westward of the line of the Treaty of Tordesillas, okay? And then here's the homeland of Spain. And the Portuguese, here in Portugal, here's Lisbon, the main trading port, had the sea routes. They had the Brazilian coastline, and then of course they came down along the Gold Coast, Ivory Coast, the Slave Coast, and took slaves to South America. And then they had little strongholds along the eastern part of Africa. They brought slaves, gold, ivory, pepper, and cloth from India. A lot of that had been traded from this area into India. Okay, and so you can see this network that the Portuguese had. And again, you can see that they got squeezed a little bit. They didn't have as much control over here anymore. It got taken by the Dutch, and they were mostly hugging along the coast and then had to skip around Cape Town and come up this way. But they still had some strongholds along the coast of Africa here, which was, you know, their wheelhouse from the days of Prince Henry. All right, now let's look at the Dutch. Okay, there's their homeland in Amsterdam, their main city. Okay, and you can see that they had begun to make their way in 1650 to South America. They eventually wrestled this area away and brought slaves over to the plantations, and they took control of Cape Town. And their big deal was that they really set up shop here in the East Indies, or what is known as modern day Indonesia. All right. Now, interestingly, I forgot to mention this, that the Spanish, of course, had the Americas, but they, through the Pope's Treaty of Tordesillas, demarcation line here, and then through the line of the Treaty of Zaragoza, they were able to set up control of the Philippines. So they had spread to that area as well. Okay, so were the Dutch the only true global power? In the end, they did displace the Portuguese dramatically. And I would say the answer is yes. You know, they really became the powerhouse of global power for, say, from 1630s to about the 1690s. That doesn't mean that Spain wasn't still doing things and Portugal wasn't still doing things, but and England got into the game as well. We're not comparing with England here yet, that's coming. But the Dutch really had the major control of the seas. You know, and the question is, if somebody has control of interplanetary space, it's the same thing as having control of all these seas, because the planets will be the ports, and whoever controls the space around those ports is going to control the ports. Okay. The largest company that's ever existed, we've established that, controlled all of the world markets, and I want to emphasize that later in the company, before it really took complete control of the world, there was this one individual, and his last name is Cohn. He says Jan Cohn, and I'm not going to try to pronounce his middle name. And this guy was trouble, all right? He really committed crimes of humanity, genocide, cleaned out populations, replaced them with slave populations. He worked with the government of the Netherlands and really convinced them that you have to use your war powers to protect our trade. And therefore, the trade will pay for the war machine will protect the trade. And so you have a circle here of self-supporting government, war power, and economic state-sponsored corporations. All right, and so this was how the VOC really became powerful. It's a new powerful human invention to do this at the expense of other humans and the natural resources of the planet. The most famous quote from this man, Jan Cohen, is, "There is no trade without war, no war without trade." Now, John Green provides his entire quote in which this is embedded in a greater context, but it's just an astonishing statement to basically have that be a founding idea upon which you would, go out into the world and practice your being a merchant, basically. This is your mission statement or justification statement for how you're going to behave as a merchant. As I say in the box here, at the bottom, this adopted axiom was put into practice across the entire globe, and every other country's ship on the open seas was the enemy, and it was effectively the First World War. Okay. This is kind of one of the most sad slides that I have, and it is depicting the fact that the company traded in humans too, and humans were another commodity. They were free labor to the point that they required sustenance was the only investment that was really required, and that was minimized, as you can imagine. And basically, slaves were captured in Africa. They were put on the ships, as shown here, put in the holds of the ships, and I decided to spare putting pictures and diagrams of what the hulls of those ships looked like and how the slaves were treated and packed in these ships, but many didn't survive. They would be brought to these holding stations. This is the Elmina Castle on the west coast of Ghana, and this was a holding pen for slaves. They were brought across the Atlantic, and then they were sold and then dispersed from here. It was originally built by the Portuguese in the 1400s, and this is a picture of it in the 1660s when it was controlled by the Dutch traders. Here's a picture in South America, in Brazil, along a sugar plantation, giving you some kind of picture of the slave labor. And somehow I feel that this painting is somewhat romanticized, given that it was painted in the past when the atrocity that was being committed was not quite as prominent in the social consciousness of artists and people that were documenting the world at the time. Now, the slave trade was so extensive, it's hard to fathom that human beings were treated in this way. And you can see here that we're talking millions of people. Okay, 5 million people shipped to Brazil, 500,000 over in the Peruvian area, okay, 200,000 in Central America, 4.5 million in the West Indies, 500,000 over in the Americas, and even then 1/3 up into the European nations. So literally 10 to 15 million enslaved people. And this, I looked it up, this is about 2 to 3% of the world's population enslaved just by the Dutch alone, right? That's a huge percentage of the world's population. Now the thing here is, we know that slavery was not invented by the Dutch or the British. Slavery has been around as long as there's been humans. Really, it's been around a long time. Even in the Roman days, we talk about Athens and how it was a great democracy. Well, yes, for a few men, it was a great democracy. Half the population was slave. Okay. And the same thing with the Arabic Empire. We realize that's why the Slavic people in northeastern Europe are called the Slavs, because that's left over from the days when they They were captured and brought down as slaves into the Muslim empires of the 700s. So it's been around. The thing that's different is this is, you know, taking it to a completely different level, okay? It's just taking it to a global level. And it's involving, you know, slavery has always involved it, but it's involving kidnapping. And kidnapping has always been a part of slavery. You know, destruction of your village, destruction of your homes, separation of your family, some people being killed and those who survive being carted off and kidnapped. So this is a horrible crime against humanity that existed. And why am I bringing all this up is not to, you know, beat down certain peoples in the past, but as a warning for the future that of what humans are capable of doing and what we need to learn from what we've done in the past. And the idea is that hopefully we will not other each other. That's a sort of a new verb, is to other somebody else, which is to, you know, see them as separate from you and then to belittle them or to you know, always want a bigger piece of the pie than the other people. And you can imagine that in the future you could have people living on asteroids and they just don't have as much resources for survival, and they could be absolutely controlled by the people who have, you know, huge gateway trade routes through the solar system. We just want to avoid this kind of thing, I hope, in the future. All right, just to give you a feeling, the Dutch Empire, it was a big deal. It covered the globe. Okay, so up here is the mainland, and I am not going to go through every single colony they had and what year it became independent, but you can see it is a long list. That is what matters. And that long list stretches from all the way back to the 1700s. And then some of these places became emancipated starting around the early 1800s. Okay, so even, you know, into the 1900s, and then here we have, you know, after World War II, we have independence happening. Okay, after World War II, and then here in the 1950s, for example. So there is a tremendous amount of reach that the Dutch had at one point in time around the world. This is 1665 through 1690. Or sorry, this is 300 years being covered here, 1665 through 1962. Just for some key moments that were part of the fall of the Dutch Empire was that in 1784, there were some battles that happened here in Southeast Asia, particularly the British keeping their Dutch East India Company going. And they basically were able to capture some of the regions from the VOC and the Dutch back in the 1780s. Now, this is somewhat after the Proclamation of Freedom, Declaration of Independence in 1776 that happened in the Americas, just to give you a context of, you know, how the world was during that moment that this nation was born, as an idea that the Dutch had total control of this world here. In 1796, about 10 years later, the French invaded the Netherlands directly, and of course that was it. They lost their power, and the VOC went bankrupt, I think, within the next 3 years. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the English, and then we'll talk a little bit about the French. This is a simple diagram of the British East India Company, which really existed from 1600 to 1858. And you can see that its rise to power in the 1800s had a lot to do with the vanquishing of the Dutch in the 1790s and 1780s. Now, it was not as extensive into the 1650s, but it then grew later and supplanted the VOC in this area. Okay, in the early days, 1612 and whatnot, they were at war, and the Dutch had succeeded in fighting off the British. And the reason why the Dutch became powerful, and I said this in the previous lecture, I'm going to say it again. If you have the most powerful navy, you control the world. That's a simple statement, and it's the simple truth. And I'd like to say, if you have the most powerful space force, you're going to control the solar system. Simple, okay? Well, the United States now has a space force. I wish it didn't have a space force, because I don't want other countries to have space forces and then have a space force war in the solar system. But hopefully that won't happen. Okay. And then the Dutch gained control of South Africa, as I told you, over the Portuguese, but then later in the 1890s and 1900s, which is well past this period that we're going to talk about with the Dutch East India Company. But just to show you the bookend to this is that the British then took over this during the Boer War. And if you know anything about Winston Churchill, of course, he was captured as a prisoner in the Boer War. He was a British soldier, and then he escaped and became very famous for that escape from prison, started his political career. All right, so again, what are the commodities? By developing this company, which also was, as you will, sponsored by the Crown of England, which means it was government endorsed. Commodities include 50% of the world's trade. This was their main list of things. Opium is one that's going to be a bit important here. Because we talked about when China withdrew in the 1430s, okay, and closed its border, that it became doomed to be the discovered and also the controlled. And in this sense, the Dutch East India Company was able to make inways into China and start doing trading with China. And what we mentioned there was that in the early 1800s was that instead of trading silver for these commodities, they decided to trade opium for these goods. And of course, this was very destructive to the population of China, and it led then to the Opium Wars. In the Opium Wars, China got its rear end cleaned up real good on that. As I say, they cleaned their chronometer. And that opened the door and weakened that nation so much further that we got the period of warlordism. And I think I've told you about that, where the country was broken up into small fiefdoms where you had a warlord. He ruled a territory. He had his armies. He protected the people. They worked for him as basically slaves. But he offered to protect them for return of that labor. And that was really China for another 70 years or so. All right. I just want to mention that they had a source of slaves too, and one of their main source of slaves was the island of Madagascar. And then it was abolished in 1858 following a bloody uprising in India. The uprising in India basically brought the company to its knees, and so it crumbled shortly thereafter. Now, why did Britain become the most powerful empire in the world during the 1700s? Okay, which is during the time of the British East India Company. Okay, remember it lasted to the mid 1800s. Is because they replaced the most powerful navy, which was the Dutch, with their navy. And so now the British became the most powerful navy, and they were able to control the world. And here I show you in 1750 the colonies and lands that were run by the British. Okay, so this small little island here eventually took control of Ireland and Scotland and Wales and unified itself. I wouldn't say it unified itself, but it was all governed under one crown. And then they had opened up these colonies and spread out to the Mississippi River, covered all the way across to Canada, had taken some areas in the Middle East, gone through Africa, you know, took over South Africa, had some British territory in Antarctica. They'd taken away from the Dutch, they'd taken Australia and New Zealand, which was also a Dutch colony, and again took over some of these areas in Malaysia. And of course, we know that they had turned India into a colony. So you can see that the British are already in the Middle East here by the 1750s and in Africa. And literally, you know, it's a very famous quote: "The sun never sets on the British Empire." And it was true. It was always noontime somewhere on the British Empire. Again, you got the most powerful navy, you got the control. And in those days, because you could take control, you did take control. What will we do in the solar system? Now let's talk about the French for a little bit. They did not rise to the same level of power, though they had the aspirations, but they did not rise to the same level of power as the British did, nor the Dutch. They had developed some small areas in the Caribbeans and on the coast of South America. And as you can see, they had some territories here in North America. There was a lot of skirmishes. There were some, the French-Indian War against the British here. There was always battles for this territory. But you'll see that the French had come down, and one of the reasons Louisiana and New Orleans has such a French influence to it, you know, the Cajun and whatnot, is that they had control of the Mississippi here, the Great Lakes areas, and this Hudson Bay, and this area in what is modern day Quebec, which is still French speaking. All right, and then here's the mainland of France itself. And the thing that happened was after the French Revolution in the late 1700s, I think it was 1789, they got imperial aspirations when Napoleon took over. And so in this color here, the first French Napoleonic Empire from 1804 to 14, and you can see that they really took over a lot of Europe. I mean, Napoleon was sort of more powerful than Hitler had become. Maybe not more powerful, but as influential in terms of land coverage of the power that he had. Hitler also took over the Scandinavian countries as well, and had some control of Africa and Greece down here. So I guess Hitler did top out Napoleon, but Napoleon was a hero of Hitler's, so to speak. And then you can see there's a lot of French influence in Africa that some people probably are fully aware of, but maybe some people have not been used to that idea or thought of that. But there's a lot of French-speaking people from Africa still. And Madagascar came under the control, some small islands out here. And then Vietnam was actually a French colony, and that played out in the 1960s when the United States decided to help the French try to maintain power there. And I think we all know the story of Vietnam. Okay, so in the 1760s, this is when they really started to lose control here from the Brits through those French Indian Wars. In 1814, after the fall of Napoleon, the first time they lost their lands out here and across these areas, particularly this dark blue area here, they lost those areas. And then all the way to 57 and 62, which is predating or basically really when the Vietnam War started, they lost their African countries. So it was only some 60 years ago, okay, that this was lost. And, you know, I was born in 1962, folks. So this is not that long ago. It may seem like a long time ago to you if you were born in the year 2000, but this history is that we've been talking about has bled into the recent past and also into the current day. So don't think yourself as separate from what happened in the past. And you are living in the continuation, the cutting front edge of all of this history that we're talking about. And I'm talking about it with you because I want you to be cognizant of what the decisions are when you go vote, or I hope you'll go vote, to help promote a different future, a better future than what our past has brought us to. All right, so in the end, the French lost a great deal of their power over time. They still have a lot of influence in Martinique and these areas here in the Caribbean as well, French-speaking areas. The space capsule payload is a fur trader from France. Now, this was, the North America was an area of contention between the UK, the United Kingdom, which I guess I shouldn't call the United Kingdom at this point, but the British Empire, which is shown here in red. Here's Eric Leifson's and the Vikings' old stomping grounds up here. So as I showed you earlier, the French had gained a lot of control of this central swath, and particularly the Louisiana area. And there was this hard contention going here. And this is another large trading company that I just wanted to mention, not nearly as large as the British East Indies Company or the United Dutch East Indies Company, the VOC, but nonetheless a very powerful company. And a couple of French traders tried to get their king to sponsor it so that they, could have that same monopoly power that these other companies we've been speaking of, the state-sponsored companies, had. And the king refused, which I think was probably not a good thing if you wanted to have French control over the area. So eventually, King Charles II in 1670 saw this as a weakness, and he sponsored some British merchants in the area. And so this became sort of a mixed territory of a lot of contention, what we would call a hot spot. Rival companies got set up. It turns out that this founded company, the Hudson Bay Company, survived throughout this. And so this is their emblem here. And their big deal was that they traded in furs, as we are showing in this diagram over here. So by 1713, this had settled down to the point that the HBC had won control of the area. But eventually it became completely British, just owned by this company. Now, just want to mention the Spanish. They had come up into this area, mostly had control of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and Utah. And they even had a lot of control into California, though it's not shown on this map, and they basically had control of Florida. Now, you're going to find out that there was a trade for some money, a lot of money, where the Brits bought Florida from Spain. And then after Jefferson had purchased the Louisiana Purchase, which was this huge swath of French land out here, then basically our border went right along the border with Spain here. And so you can imagine what happened. There was some contention, and there was the Mexican-American War, and we took Texas and New Mexico, and we took Arizona. And that became the New Mexico-Arizona Territory. Texas became the Republic of Texas. And interestingly, New Mexico and Arizona were the last two contiguous 48, if you will, to become states. They became states in 1912, just a little over 100 years ago. Now, I want to talk to you about what happens when people find opportunity. And the bottom line is, when people find opportunity, they'll plow over the other people to get the goods and exploit that opportunity, basically in the pursuit of gold. And in this example, this is quite literally, this was about gold, okay? So I guess I should talk about this side first. before I get into this side. So let's go back to this, and I consider that a teaser for what I'm going to talk about over here. In the 1800s, I just wanted to remind you the United Kingdom had finally taken some control of this area. The United States had formed. This is the Louisiana Purchase I was talking about, which we took from the French. Mind you that it was in contention whether Spain felt it owned that, so they felt stabbed in the back when it was purchased by the United States. As you can see, Spain has a lot of influence here. Here's the Portuguese. Here is the United States. And interestingly, Russia has control here of what is modern day Alaska. Okay. So this territory right here was the territory that got taken from the Mexicans, the Spanish, in the Spanish-American War, or the Mexican-American War, which happened in the 1840s, about 20 years before, 15 years before the Civil War. Okay, and this is what gave us the border along the Rio Grande that we have today, and as I said, the Arizona, New Mexico territories. Okay, so what we're going to talk about here is the fact that this area here really was opened up through the Louisiana Purchase, and then California and Arizona territories were opened up. But this whole area was still really not conquered land in the sense that I would say is that it really still belonged to the indigenous people. They were continually pushed westward and continually pushed westward. So you have this area here, which is really still populated and controlled by the indigenous people. And with time, that just wasn't going to last. And what expedited and accelerated that process was the discovery of gold in 1848. And so what happened was that this hastened a conduit to get people to California as fast as possible from the east to basically extract and claim this gold. And one of the reasons that California became a state so quickly. All right, so again, what are we going to have happen? We're going to have a set of companies be subsidized by the government. In this case, the US government subsidized the railroad companies in order to develop something called the Transcontinental Railroad. And again, we have the marriage of a desire for financial gain, okay, and new technologies. The railroad, the steam engine and the railroad was a breakthrough technology of its day. Okay, they were the warp drive spaceships of the day. Okay, but there was no conduit using this technology that would get you all the way to California. And so they developed the Transcontinental Railroad between 1863 and 1869. Do excuse that. It's having lived in the 1900s, that 9 just, I got muscle memory for that. So between 1863 and 1869, they built the Transcontinental Railroad. And the railroad companies were given land to both sides of the track as return, and they were subsidized in paying for the materials and labor. So that was a really good deal for the railroad companies. And what the one company, I can't remember the name of the two of them, oh, here it is, the Central Pacific in green, built across from Sacramento out to Utah, and the Union Pacific came out here from Iowa, Omaha, also to Utah. Getting through these mountains here was very, very painful. And I have to say that, again, there was sort of a semi-slave labor situation going on, but this time it was with Chinese immigrants. So anyhow, this is a celebrated moment at Promontory Summit. It's called the Driving of the Golden Spike. I think most people have heard of it. It happened May 10th, 1869. Now, just for fun, I'd like to tell you that Apollo 10 launched for the moon as the dress rehearsal for Apollo 11. It launched for the moon 100 years and 8 days later on May 18th, 1969. And then it was on July 16 that Apollo 11 launched. So again, we see technology stepping forward, and this new breakthrough technology is taking us to new places. There's no gold on the moon, so we didn't keep going back. But had there been gold on the moon, I guarantee you that we would have gateway orbiting stations around the moon, and we would have stations orbiting the Earth, and people would be ferreting back and forth, bringing that commodity back to the Earth, and there would be settlements on the moon. But because there's not a profit to be turned, guess what? We didn't keep going. Now we realize that asteroids have trillions of dollars of resources on them. So that's what's coming next. Well, what I want to say here is that this transcontinental railroad, the breakthrough technology of the day, the warp drive spaceship that got you across the country, tied this together, and basically then the government put together what's called the Homesteading Act, which says if you go out and take the train somewhere, get off of it, go out, stake your claim on some land, work it for X years, you own it. And of course, people came in droves, and that is really what settled out the American Indians and allowed the United States citizens, if you will, to take control of the rest of the country. Again, if we want to take claim of planets and asteroids, what do we have to do? We have to build a transcontinental railroad. We have to build gateway orbiting stations and learn how to navigate those and build these routes. Once we put that infrastructure into place in the solar system, in the same way that people populated and filled out the United States, we will populate and fill out the solar system. Okay, this is our last slide, and this is to show you the power of the outcomes of the sea race. This is a teaser slide, if you will, for the next lecture. Now, we call these the Roman countries because literally their history all emanated out of the Greek and the Hellenistic Greek culture, and then the Roman culture. Okay, and as we know that has been influenced through Northwestern Europe. Okay, and so we have the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British. And so when you put all of this together and look at the areas where they have had control over the world, it's marked in red here. You can see the areas that have been under the influence of those countries who chose to put in the resources to go out and explore. Now, I used to think of that in a very romantic way. If you go out and explore, you have influence. You at home, your people at home, and the people that are abroad that you've sent out, they flourish, okay? Well, of course they flourish because in the day of takeism and of imperial colonialism, it was an unfair balance. But nonetheless, those who chose not to, like China, that reverted backward and I should say turned their sights inward and did not explore outward, but they tried to close their borders to influence, were doomed to then suffer the consequences of that. And the question is, what will we do in the future? Let's look at ourselves for a minute, the United States. Are we going to be relevant 200 years from now in the solar system? Or are we going to be irrelevant in the solar system? Or are we going to be a nation that tries to be relevant, like the French tried to be relevant during the 1800s and 1700s, in terms of imperialism around the globe, but then lose that battle to somebody else? Is there going to be fighting, war, contention, or Again, are we going to learn how to distribute this wealth in a fair way, in a sustainable way? Is Frank White's overview effect going to change the way people feel when they go out into space and help unify us? I remain somewhat doubtful. I am an idealist and a romanticist by heart myself, but I am very worried that the direction that new space is going now, that it's really going to be controlled by some big commercial companies, and it's going to be about mining asteroids, getting titanium, bringing it back to Earth, and just making trillions of dollars off this kind of industry. And then eventually people will settle out in space because they'll need them. I would like to think that we could do this more along the Captain Cook lines and go out and do it scientifically, but in my older age, I've become a little bit more jaded. As I've learned more about this history that I've shared with you, I've become just a little bit more cynical about what that future might look like. But your generation has the pen in their hand, and you are now writing the chapter. Okay, so what chapter are you going to write, and where are you going to take humanity? You've got the pen in your hand, people. Okay, write with it and write well. That's all I want to say. Okay, all right, so when we come back next time, we are going to talk about, we're going to look at a lot of maps of the world, and we're going to talk about maps of like equality in terms of qualities of life, economics, communications, trade routes. We're going to look at all these maps of the globe. They're very much going to be like the one I just showed you, where it's dominated by Western Europe. Okay, and we know about the inequity of the world today, and this is the reason. We invented state-sponsored capitalism, which in a sense is a combination of takeism and imperialism plus colonialism. And we are now just beginning to emerge from that era in your lifetime. And the consequences are still amongst us. In certain regions of the globe, there is still tremendous conflict over people trying to get their sovereignty back and have control, and the pursuit of freedom and you know, I hate to say it, like in the Declaration of Independence, you know, a right to pursuit of happiness and health and well-being. So on those notes, which are a little more positive, I will say adieu, and we'll see you in the next lecture.